In 1933, the German population brought Adolf Hitler into power with 49% of the popular vote. The next largest party got 18. And this isn't just a one-off. It's happened before in history. Fully fledged democracies voting dictators into power. And if this isn't a one-off, then it means that it can happen again. And the thing that we need to realize to ourselves is that if a democracy were to vote in a dictator again, they wouldn't vote in Hitler again, for example. They wouldn't vote in someone using the exact same language. Someone who came in demonizing Jews and Bolsheviks probably wouldn't be received very popularly. But the point is that the psychological mechanisms that once allowed people in democracies to elect a dictator and that have repeatedly done so, they haven't gone away. Human nature hasn't changed. So if humans are capable of living in a democracy and willingly electing a dictator, even if the language changes, even if the language that people use and the exact terms that get bandied about are different, the psychological and social dynamics behind democracies electing dictators and dictators coming into power in democracies are the same. So the question is, how the hell does all that happen? And ladies and gentlemen, that is the subject of today's episode. Welcome to Polymath. Now, for those of you who don't know, my name is Daniel Aaron Levy, and this is Polymath. It's an educational radio show where I take issues that I think you guys will find interesting, and I yap about them, essentially. But it's not just me, like, plucking stuff out of my arse. Like, it is based on what expert consensus are. I'm trying to summarize a consensus for you guys. I'm trying to summarize lots of different research for you guys and integrate lots of different sources. Now, today's episode is a little bit late because I had another episode 16 all recorded, and it was basically about what political position IQ correlated with, and I haven't released it because it's a bit dicey. I was going to release it. I was really excited to release it, and then my family were like unanimously like, you shouldn't do this, and I was like, really? And they were like, yes, you obviously shouldn't do that. Don't release that. So I haven't, but if you want it, please let me know. I will send it to you. It's all recorded. It's done. So I can send it to you. But anyway, so today we're going to be looking at, first of all, the question of why people voted for Hitler really is about how democracies elect dictators. And the other thing, in a democracy, we need to analyze, in order to understand why voters vote for a dictator, we need to look at their psychology. We need to look at what's actually going on in their head that make them choose to do that. And the field dedicated to that is political psychology. So political psychology, it's a subfield of psychology. It's fascinating. It's incredibly interesting. And it's basically, well, in my opinion anyway. Then I would find it interesting because I'm choosing to talk about it too. But if you're listening to this, you're probably going to find it interesting too. And it's just about, basically, when it comes to people's political beliefs and their political decisions and their political stances, that is a psychological phenomenon. That's something that's happening in their heads. And the analysis of, the exploration of that is political psychology. And this episode is about fully fledged democracies. Because here's the thing, when we look at democracy, countries don't exist as one of two discrete categories, democracy or dictatorship. It's actually a spectrum. And there's an index published by The Economist, which is commonly used, just called the Democracy Index. And it just measures how democratic a country is, a polity is. And kind of factors that are used to measure that is basically, are those elections free? Are those elections fair? Is there any intimidation or is there any bias going on in the way that these elections are conducted? Do these elections actually make a difference? Do you have civil rights? Do you have the right for freedom, for the freedom of press? Do you have freedom of association? So the ability to kind of get together and form trade unions or political groups or political parties, etc. Can you challenge the government? Is there rule of law? So can people in power do whatever they want, or do they have to obey the same laws that everyone else does? Are there limits on the executive power in society? So are there sort of checks and balances on the government and what they can do? And do we have an overemphasis here on national security and surveillance and law and order and keeping people in line? All of these are the various factors in the World Democracy Index. And it's a very common index that's used nowadays. And what this is, and basically, sorry, I'm using lots of what this is, essentially, let me get to the fucking point. So basically, countries lie on a spectrum in that index, and at one end you have fully fledged liberal democracies. So the phrase liberal democracies, not all democracies are liberal democracies. Liberal democracies are based on certain psychological assumptions. And when I say liberal, I don't mean liberal in the sense of the Western left wing, because when we say liberal, we tend to think of that as opposed to conservatives. When I say liberal, I mean liberalism. And liberalism is a political philosophy that came from the West in about the 1700s, but it also had a little heyday in classical Greece. And liberalism is basically the idea that the way that we should base society and governance is based on reason. We shouldn't base it on blind respect for authority. We shouldn't base it on tradition. We shouldn't base it on custom or religion. It should be based on reason. And it should basically be based on making sure that people are happy. The whole basis of liberalism, in terms of politics anyway, is the idea that the rules of society should be based on what gives the greatest happiness to the greatest number. There should be some kind of rational underpinning for that. That's a massive oversimplification of what liberalism is. More information on that can be found. So in episode 9, I talk about liberalism a lot. That's a big oversimplification. I'm just giving you a kind of gist of what it is. I'm giving you a vibe. I'm giving you a liberalist vibe. We talk about liberalism in basically every episode in Polymath, though. We love a bit of liberalism here. We yap about liberalism all the time. Now, so at the one end we have fully fledged democracies, liberal democracies. At the other hand, we have fully fledged dictatorships. And kind of in the middle, we have hybrid regimes. So these are called anocracies. And these are kind of mixtures between democracies and authoritarian regimes. And what we're analyzing here are in fully fledged democracies. In democracies where people start out with this full complement of rights and democracy and autonomy and liberty. What makes them give that away? And this is really, really relevant because in the 21st century, what we're seeing is a lot of democratic backsliding. And democratic backsliding is this process of regime change. Where a polity starts going down upon that the democracy index. It starts moving down the spectrum. So it's the opposite of democratization. And there's also proposed cause of democratic backsliding. I mean, a really big one is economic inequality, which has been shooting up since the 1970s. In the 1970s, in the Western world, and from there outwards, kind of emanating from that, a series of economic reforms known as the economic philosophy of neoliberalism has been put forward. And that's basically involved deregulating the market, but that's involved a massive proliferation of societal inequality and also a stagnation of real wages for the bottom economic quartiles of society. And that a massive amount of economic inequality has led to just massive cultural inflammation, culture wars. And I mean, we also, cause of democratic backsliding are also cultural, they're socio-cultural. So they're things like especially conservative responses to massive cultural changes. Because as society has gotten richer over the past few centuries, it's gradually gotten more liberal, it's gotten more progressive. We're going to be exploring what all these terms mean much later, don't worry, I'm just giving you an overview. But that means that if society does change, if it is getting more progressive, there's going to be a backlash to that change. And democratic backsliding is conceptualized as quite a key cause of that. As a key consequence of that. Now, the most vulnerable regions of democratic backsliding are, as you can imagine, those who have democratized only quite recently. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, so in the 1990s, lots of new democracies formed. And it tends to be these countries which are a bit more vulnerable, but it's a global phenomenon. It's by no means limited to countries which have newly democratized. So some examples of countries that have undergone democratic backsliding, a really big example is India. Under Modi, who's part of the BJP. Hungary is a great example with Viktor Orban as well. Israel under Netanyahu. We also see Poland, Romania, Ethiopia, El Salvador, Serbia, Turkey. Turkey under Erdogan. Again, that's a really big one that you've probably heard of in the news. Georgia. So democratic backsliding, it's something which is really affecting the 21st century right now. So all this question of how democracies elect dictators, it's all really, really relevant to our time. This is all stuff that we really want to know. Now, when we actually take a big analysis of why that's happening, because we talked about economic inequality and cultural changes and cultural backlash, but populism can be seen as a phenomenon which kind of sums up all these different factors and integrates it. And populism is basically, so I'll define it in a bit, but actually a really nice quote to start with. So there's a scholar called Pippa Norris, and she's in the University of Sydney. And she basically says that the two biggest forces that pose a threat to Western liberal democracy, so these two big drives of democratic backsliding, are, open quotes, sporadic and random terrorist attacks on domestic soil, which damage feelings of security, and the rise of populist authoritarian forces which feed parasitically upon these fears. So what does that mean? So what actually is populism? Because that's probably a word that you guys have heard. You would have heard the word populism maybe in political discourse. So you might be thinking, what the hell is that? So populism is it's a political phenomenon. It's an ism. It's not necessarily it's not an ideology in the sense that communism or socialism are ideologies. It's more a kind of approach. It's more a kind of political stance than an ideology. And what populism is, so populism isn't necessarily by definition authoritarianism, but in the context of the 21st century, it basically is authoritarianism. And this kind of force of populist authoritarianism is currently the big driver behind democratic backsliding. And that in itself is fed by economic inequality, and it's fed by these social cultural changes that we see. So populism it has these kind of three main features according to Norris. One is a rhetorical emphasis on the idea that legitimate political authority is based on popular sovereignty and majority rule. So what does that mean? It means that figures like Modi or Bolsonaro or Trump, they don't talk about limiting democracy and limiting civil rights. And this is a really key thing which distinguishes populism from fascism. Fascism explicitly rejects liberalism. It explicitly rejects this idea that everyone has an equal right to happiness and that happiness needs to be what we base the governance of society on. And it explicitly rejects the idea common to liberalism that freedom and equality are inherently good things. So liberalism is all about saying freedom and equality are inherently good. How you define freedom and equality varies massively based on the interpretation of liberalism. But the basic stance is that these are good things. Fascism explicitly rejects that. Fascism says freedom and equality are not good things. Whereas populism frames itself within the terms of freedom and equality, more so freedom than equality. And if you look at like a linguistic analysis of leftism and rightism, in America, for example, when I say that, so the liberal versus conservative spectrum, equality tends to be more of a liberalist preserve, and conservatives tend to talk about freedoms and things like that. We're going to talk about what leftism and rightism, I'm going to mention what leftism and rightism actually mean in just a little bit. But basically, these right-wing figures aren't explicitly saying that they're going to undemocratize the country. In fact, they usually appeal to democracy and freedom to do this. So a second feature of populism is disapproval of and challenges to the legitimacy of established holders of political, cultural, and economic power. So this is stuff like criticizing mainstream media, criticizing mainstream news, criticizing the establishment. And three is leadership by maverick outsiders who claim to speak for the vox populi and serve ordinary people. Vox populi just means voice of the people, and it refers to kind of the will of the masses, what the majority of people want. And this is the classic thing with populism. We see charismatic individuals who come up and they claim to be speaking for the little guy. They claim to be criticizing the establishment. Often this is in direct contradiction to their actual policies. Trump is a great example of this because Trump's actual economic policies are neoliberal, which I mentioned earlier. They're designed for deregulation of the market, reduction of financial controls, increase of privatization. And basically, the result of these policies is an increase in economic inequality, huge gains in real wages for the top 1%, huge gains for big business, essentially, a stagnation of real wages for most quartiles, for the kind of bottom economic quartiles of society. But despite being part of the economic establishment, despite having policies which benefit the economic establishment, and himself being a member of the economic elite of American society, he claims to be criticizing that establishment. But the point is that mistrust of the establishment is very, very important. So that's kind of a definition of what populist authoritarianism is. And what's interesting is that in authoritarian regimes, populism is actually a force of democratization, which makes sense because if the whole point is an appeal to the mass of the people, then if you live in a dictatorship, that's actually a big step forward. So if Putin, for example, started talking about appealing to... Well, actually, Putin kind of does use this rhetoric. But if, I don't know, a really brutal dictator, like if Bokassa, for example, one of the sub-Saharan African dictators, the really brutal ones in the Cold War, started using that rhetoric, that would arguably that would be progressive. But in Western liberal democracies, really, to divorce that from its cultural context of being Western. In fully fledged democracies in general, populism is a big drive of democratic backsliding. So here's the thing, populist authoritarianism has been gaining a lot of traction recently, and not just in the West, worldwide as well. And we're seeing, and lots of people have been commenting on this worldwide shift to the right. This kind of movement of not just the Western world, that is really a thing here, but just a global shift. So for example, in India and Brazil. And a quick question, before we even address anything that's going on here, is what does this actually mean? What do left wing and right wing actually mean? So I talk about this more in episode 8 of Polymath, which is just called What Do Left Wing and Right Wing Actually Mean? So that's nice and simple. And I really do recommend watching that episode. I would. That's a bit arsey for me to say, actually. I really would recommend watching that episode, actually. Yeah, no shit, Daniel, you fucking made it. But I do recommend watching it. I think it's important, but you don't need to. All episodes of Polymath, the whole point is that you can enjoy them individually. So, what do left wing and right wing actually mean? And I'm saying this because in order to understand why people vote for dictators, Dictators can be left-wing or right-wing, etc. But the key feature of being of a dictator is authoritarianism. And I'm mentioning that because when we break down leftism and rightism, we can actually break it down to three separate axes, and of which libertarianism versus authoritarianism is the key one here. So it's really important, before we understand why people voted for Hitler, why democracies elect dictators, we need to understand this basic political terminology. We need to know basic political science. So what do these terms left-wing and right-wing actually mean? Let's try and use political science to define these properly, say what they actually mean from an objective perspective. So when we think of the terms left-wing and right-wing, we're kind of confronted with this massive mess of ideas and lots of different things. So we tend to have this idea of left-wing as being like associated with feminism or trans rights or free healthcare, or at the furthest reaches kind of socialism, communism, etc., etc. And the parties involved sort of being the Labour Party, the Democrat Party, etc., etc. And rightism is being involved in opposition to recent changes in feminism and trans rights and LGBTQ plus rights and recognitions. It's associated with kind of more free market economics, associated with more adherence to tradition and authority and family values and all that. And at the farthest ends with extremism like the Nazi Party, fascism, etc. And it's associated with parties like the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, etc., etc. And we have this huge range of ideas all embodied in this one-dimensional axis, this 1D spectrum of left-wing to right-wing. Some people like to see it as like a sort of horseshoe, saying that the furthest extremes of each end are actually quite similar to each other. So in the sense of Stalin, so what Stalin was doing in the USSR and what Hitler was doing in Nazi Germany, for example. But actually, if we look at political science, if we read the literature, if we see what experts are saying, and also we just have a look at what all these different ideas and values are, we can distill that one-dimensional spectrum into three different spectra. And that spectra, so there's an economic spectrum, a political spectrum, and a social-cultural spectrum. So when we look at left-wing, right-wing, it contains within itself these three different elements. And on that economic spectrum, we have a spectrum of economic leftism to economic rightism. And that's just about the degree to which the government intervenes in the economy. So economic leftism is about a greater degree of intervention. Economic rightism is about a lesser degree of intervention. And at the farthest end of economic leftism, we have it when the government controls everything in the economy and there's no markets involved. At the furthest end of economic rightism, we have it so that there's zero rules and regulations for the economy at all. Now, that second spectrum is the political power spectrum. It's about how political power is divided and used in a society. Who gets it and what can it do? And it expressed in terms of libertarianism versus authoritarianism. Libertarianism is the belief that government interference in the daily lives of its citizens should be more limited. Authoritarianism is the opposite. At the far end of authoritarianism, we have totalitarian states such as Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. To return to the earlier example, at the far end of libertarianism is, well, to use the example that we have now, technically it would be anarchism, but in the context of the states that we have currently, the most libertarian states are the Nordic model states. And that third spectrum, this spectrum of socio-cultural values, it's basically about what the social views of a society are. What's its takes on stuff? What are its opinions? And it ranges from progressive to conservative. And it's about issues like feminism, veganism, trans rights, LGBTQ plus rights, animal rights, environmental protections, etc., etc. But it's not just about specific policies, it's also about value judgments. So the progressive end of the spectrum, we see a greater emphasis on the values of freedom, the values of empathy and caring for the rights of others, and the values of equality, specifically equality of opportunity. At the conservative end of the spectrum, we have a greater emphasis on the values of tradition, authority, order, hierarchy, equality in sort of proportionality, equality in the sense of proportionality, so people getting what they're owed, and also a greater recognition of loyalty. So we're seeing value issues as well as issues on specific policies. And the key thing is that when we talk about economic leftism and economic rightism, for example, we can see objective definitions for far economic left and far economic right. That is objective, that's absolute. But when it comes to left-wing and right-wing as general terms, or progressive, conservative as general terms, these are relative terms and not absolute. So what one society would consider left-wing and progressive, another society would consider very right-wing or conservative. So for example, in American politics, the Democratic Party is seen as left-wing. Whereas if you transplanted that same institution with its same views into, let's say, Norway, it would be seen as right-wing, for example. Another example is how in the southern United States in the mid-1800s, in the antebellum South, slavery was seen as a good thing. It wasn't just seen as a necessary evil, it was seen as an actual positive good. That was the normative view of society at the time. So if someone had came along and said that slavery is a bad thing, relative to that normative view, they would have been seen as left-wing or progressive. That's not the case in the southern United States now, where anyone who espoused the view that slavery was a good thing would be considered to be at the far right of the political spectrum. So we've got some juicy definitions done. Let's get down to what we're actually trying to talk about here. Why do people do it? Why do people elect dictators? Because if you think about it, it's against your interest. If you're a citizen of democracy, you want to preserve your rights. There is a human desire for autonomy. We like autonomy. We like being able to do what we need to do. So why do people do it? So here's the thing. In the case of dictators like Hitler, rational observers can see what he's trying to do. Because in the build-up to 1933, it was clear what Hitler stood for. He didn't talk about freedom and equality. He openly talked about law and order and power and strength. The Nazis had paramilitary organizations, the SA and the SS. And these are just groups of uniformed, essentially thugs, who would just go around and beat the shit out of people who disagree with them. I mean, in fact, you see this with maybe not the form of paramilitary forces, but you see similar kind of things with populist authoritarians today. They try and intimidate their opponents. They try and use language that undermines rule of law. They try to build up cult of personality. Rational, detached observers can see budding dictators. It's not something that blindsides you. It's not like some kind of progressive, woolly candidate suddenly gains power and snaps. No, you know what they're standing for. They're telling you what they're standing for. So here's the thing. In the case of dictators coming into power, rational observers can see what they're trying to do. So establishing a dictatorship, getting a democracy to vote for you really boils down to one key thing: a reduction of rationality. And we're going to be recurring to that again and again and again. And that's what all these mechanisms come down to: reduction of rationality. Now, that's not a term that I've copying from the literature. I've coined that myself, but I'm coining that term not because I'm just sort of like sitting in a room like, oh, wouldn't this be sick to say? What I'm trying to do is use my own language to capture trends in literature. I'm trying to distill what experts are saying to you. That's my goal here. I'm not trying to like feed my own opinions and thought processes to you. I just want to tell you what people who know more than me are saying. So here's a key thing to understand about human nature. Humans are capable of rationality, but they are not inherently rational. Humans are fundamentally irrational. They are emotion driven. Because when we're faced with strong emotion, and you see this in politics all the time, for example, do you know why it's so fucking hard to change someone's mind in politics? Because people don't think rationally about politics. People's political orientation is not a function of rational consideration of beliefs. It's a much deeper expression of emotions. It's about the kind of moral perspectives that you have. It's about the deep feelings that you have. And rational arguments aren't going to change that because it's an emotional process. And when we talk about the idea of humans not being more emotional than rational creatures, there's a myriad of evidence for this. So you've probably heard of this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, by these guys, Daniel Kahneman, Noah Tversky. They actually won a Nobel Prize for it. So shout out to Kahneman and Tversky. Good job. And it talks about this idea of system 1 versus system 2 cognition. And the essential idea is that most of the decisions we make, 95% of the decisions we make, are fast and unconscious. But also, human cognition is riddled with things called heuristics. These are mental shortcuts, and they're all these biases and fallacies that are kind of built into the way that we think. And we have these innate capacities, human capacities, to stereotype, to group things together, to think irrationally, to look for information that confirms our beliefs rather than challenging them, to rationalize things that don't agree with our worldview. Now, I could talk about human irrationality for a really, really long time. I talk about this in episode 15 much more carefully when it comes to is humanity getting dumber. And it's also something that I talk about in another project that I've done. God, I'm just plugging everything now. So what I'm going to shamelessly self-promote is I did this project on happiness and human nature. It's on Spotify. It's a podcast on Spotify and YouTube. So if you're watching it on YouTube, you're right there. It's called Understanding Happiness, Science, and the Buddha. And episode 1 basically explores exactly how the mind works, exactly why human cognition works, how psychologically and in terms of brain anatomy, how I can prove to you that humanity is inherently irrational. But I can't go into that now because we've got so much to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. I've got so much to yap to you about. Fuck me, I'm already speaking at like 52 words per minute. I've got so much information to throw at you guys. There's so much to talk about. But the key thing is, people are not rational. And if you can trigger people's emotions, if you can get people in that emotional place, when it comes to human decision making, emotion tends to supersede rationality. So if you're a dictator, what you don't want to do is people thinking in a rational, detached way, weighing up the logical merits of what you're saying. What you want is to appeal to people's emotions. What you want is to get people scared, you want to get them angry, and you want to get them loyal. All these are emotional behaviors. So what we need to do when we talk about how how democracies elect dictators, we need to look at the psychological mechanisms that they use to do this. So how do dictators actually do this? Or budding dictators? Or populist authoritarians? Because they do the same thing. And that's not saying that all populist authoritarians necessarily want to be dictators. I mean, Boris Johnson is an example of a populist authoritarian. But it's debatable whether he'd want to establish a dictatorship, although his proroguing of parliament was pretty dictatorial. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the pathway to dictatorship in the 21st century is by this populist authoritarian route. That's how it's happening right now. And that's how it's happened as in the past as well. So in the 1930s, Hitler and Mussolini took power by the same mechanisms. Now, dictators aren't necessarily all populist, they're not necessarily all right-wing, but in the current cultural context that we find ourselves in, this is how it's done. And the same psychological mechanisms that we're going to be talking about here are the ones that are being used by populist authoritarians around the world. They're being used by Orban, they're being used by Modi, they're being used by Bolsonaro, by Netanyahu, by Trump, by Boris Johnson. These individuals vary in the extent to which they deploy these mechanisms. Perhaps, for example, Boris Johnson, and I'm sure there's lots of figures that I haven't mentioned here in European politics who are still classifiable as populist authoritarians, but they're just not as intensely so as Orban or Modi or Bolsonaro or Trump or etc. But the point is, this is what they all do. So, the key thing to do here, the fundamental thing, is to define an outgroup. What is that? So the way that humans think, have you ever noticed that humans tend to cleave to like an us versus them kind of thinking? We do it in politics, we do it in football teams, we do it in actually really kind of everything. We even do it in professions. So there's this episode of Friends where Ross is working at the museum and like how museum scientists and museum like tour staff kind of have beef with each other low-key. That's a really niche reference. You can tell that I've watched Friends like 5 or 6 times through. Even though Ross is a bit of a shitwipe. But that's not really the point. We're not making moral judgments on Ross Geller here. We're talking about politics. So the point is that there's an innate human tendency to do this. And a scientific way of putting that is in-group, out-group thinking. Human beings tend to adopt certain social identities. For example, Arsenal fans, or doctors, or liberals, or British, or Brits, or Frenchmen. And they tend to favor other members of those identities. So this is called an in-group. It's a psychological in-group. It's people who share this identifying characteristic with you. But that means that by definition, there has to be an out-group. People who don't share that. So for example, liberals versus conservatives, or proletariat versus bourgeoisie, or Brits versus Frenchmen, or Everton fans versus Reds. You know, we see this occurring all the time. And it makes sense from an evolutionary psychology perspective. Because remember, we evolved to be hunter-gatherers. So all these psychological mechanisms, all the nuts and bolts of how human minds work are adapted for that landscape. And in that landscape, you'll be traveling around with a band of people of maybe a few dozen. And so in Western Europe, homicide rates are about 1 per 100,000 per year. In non-state societies, so in an average of 27 non-state societies, so hunter-gatherer groups, basically, that homicide rate is about 537 times higher. So if you're a band of hunter-gatherers and you see another band of hunter-gatherers, it makes perfect sense for you to see them as an out-group. It makes sense for you to view your in-group with empathy and your out-group with hostility, because those are actual threats to you. The problem is the psychological remnants of that are really, really bad for modern society. Racism is a classic example. Racism is an example of in-group, out-group thinking based on a really easily identifiable characteristic: skin color. There's no inherent... Now, there's been a shit ton of studies on this. There's no causation between skin color and empathy or IQ or morality or anything like that. It's just a trait which that in-group, out-group system locks onto and finds. But here's the thing. Outgroups can be, the definition of an outgroup can change massively. Everyone has them, but they're very different. So for a KKK, the outgroup would be Jews or minorities. For a liberal progressive right now, in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict, the outgroup would be Israelis. In the context of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of another political context. In the context of Marxists, the outgroup would be the bourgeoisie. You know, the outgroup itself is very variable. So even if you're not a racist, that doesn't mean you don't have an outgroup. It's just that it's a different outgroup. And the key thing the dictators classically try and do, what they all try and do, is find and demonize that outgroup. So the 1930s, the way that Hitler did it was by talking about Jews and Bolsheviks. Because if you have people pissed off at an out-group, what that does, first of all, is enforce loyalty to the in-group and to the social norms of the in-group. But also, that hatred, that fear, what all this does is overwhelm rationality. It gets people scared, it gets people angry, they want something to be done. And hence that we see the rise of the, open quote, strong man in political life. Someone who comes onto the political scene and thunders, yes, I know what can be done. There is an outgroup, there is a threat, I'm going to deal with that threat. But again, the nature of the outgroup changes a lot. So right now in the Western world, it's classically immigrants. So, and loads of all the right-wing parties currently active in the West, they all talk about this. They all demonize immigrants. So not only do they mention immigrants as a threat, but they explicitly try to dehumanize them. So they refer to them in animalistic terms such as cockroaches. They refer to them in, or vermin, for example, which I think Trump has actually done directly. I mean, he's obviously said that immigrants are eating cats and dogs in Ohio. I'm just using Trump as an example because you'll all know him. But the point is that this language of dehumanization, this language of taking a group of human beings and applying animalistic characteristics to them and talking about them in terms of filth and disgust, in terms of dirtiness, that's a language which is common to any kind of outgroup demonization. So we've seen that really since the start of history, since the start of human beings. That's what people do. And again, that use of cleanliness, so evoking a sense of disgust is very important, because moral disgust, i.e. contempt for a group of people and their actions, and physical disgust, pathogenic disgust it's called, it's the same emotion. So classically, outgroups are demonized by appealing to that sense of disgust, and they all do that. All budding dictators need to do that. So for Hitler, for example, first was Jews and Bolsheviks, but then as you gain traction, the outgroup can become people who just oppose you. So Hitler classically moved on to define the outgroup as the opposing left-wing party in Germany, the SPD. So in the 1933 election, the SPD was the party who got the 18% of the popular vote. So the key thing is with budding dictators, or populist authoritarians in this case, is that you find an outgroup, but then you start demonizing the defenders of the outgroup, and then you also demonize people who deviate from the norms of the in-group. So you're not just defining an outgroup, you're trying to increase the cohesion of the in-group. You're trying to increase the belief homogeneity of the in-group. You're trying to get everyone to think the same way. You're punishing deviance from the norms of the in-group. You're punishing non-conformity. And the whole point of promoting the idea of an outgroup is to promote this idea of threat. Threat is the key thing. You have to promote an idea of threat. This is always what happens. In any episode of democratic backsliding, there is always this narrative of being under threat. And that threat could come from immigrants, for example, but also in the Western world, we're seeing this narrative of threat, which just comes from the various... So the Western world socio-culturally has become much more progressive over the past few decades, because the Western world has generally got richer. And as countries get richer, they get more progressive. And what we've seen in the past 50 years is a massive shift in the way that society treats women, in the way that society treats homosexuals, in the way that society treats any kind of minority, really. There's been a really big qualitative change. Like the idea of you turn on the TV and you have black superheroes or female superheroes, i.e. you have minorities or marginalized figures in the position of role models, in the position of high status figures, is really, really unprecedented. That's really new. But the thing is that if you have any progressive drift in society, there's always going to be a conservative backlash to it. And that's another really key aspect of threat. So in the Western world, the threat here isn't just immigrants. It can be feminism, or it can be changing gay rights, or it can be changes in religiosity. That's a big thing as well. But feminism is a really classic bugbear used by populist authoritarians. They talk about feminism taking over, or political correctness gone mad. Political correctness is the classic example. And ladies and gentlemen, no matter what your views on political correctness are, I'm not asking you to say that being PC is right or wrong. What I want to impress to you is the fact that budding dictators will use this idea to gain your allegiance. They will build on the idea of political correctness gone mad to promote the idea of threat. I'm not trying to tell you guys what to believe. What I'm trying to tell you guys is that you are not immune to propaganda. And this is how it works. Some form of threat gets defined. And another thing is that threat tends to promote authoritarianism. More on that later, but when we have this conception of threat, people's values tend to change from self-expression based to survival based. More on that later, but basically people start valuing conformity, security, obedience, stability, and safety over values like autonomy, agency, freedom, inclusivity, etc., etc. So threat is really, really key. And again, because this happens to a large degree as a result of progressive shift in society, and society's been getting more progressive since the French Revolution, well, since the 1700s really in the West, what we see is we get this progressive spike in populist authoritarianism. So you see it in the 70s as well. Society had gotten way more progressive in the post-war era up until the 70s. I mean, you have the 60s, this landmark civil rights legislation. And in the 70s, that provoked a really massive right-wing backlash. And that's exactly what happened. And you see it, for example, in the British National Party is an example of it, in the loss of affirmative action in the United States. So affirmative action in the United States was basically like diversity quotas. Because in the 1960s, basically like 2% of black people were counted as middle class. Like in America, before civil rights era, loads of black people, especially in the South, basically lived in ghettos. They didn't have access to good jobs or good education because no one wanted to give them those jobs and education. And affirmative action was the federal government stepping in and saying, right, if we need to step in and force people to hire black people. And it worked. Black people's entry in the middle class accelerated rapidly, actually. And in the 60s, people were kind of just about okay with it. There weren't like, it wasn't like an impossible thing to do because society was very prosperous at the time. But then prosperity went down in the 70s. There was a large increase in right-wing backlash. There was an increase in populist authoritarianism due to this combination of economic distress and preceding social-cultural change. The exact same thing happened in the 1930s. The world had gotten way more progressive. I mean, Weimar Germany is the classic example. Since World War I, Germany went from an authoritarian semi-democracy, but really a bit of a militarist monarchy, to a fully fledged democracy. And with that came a massive social-cultural shift in the rights of women and minorities. And that social-cultural shift, coupled with economic distress, led to the authoritarian populist backlash of the 1930s. The same thing happened in the 1870s. You know, it's cyclical in this way. So what we're seeing now is a different stage of that cycle. We have economic distress coupled with socio-cultural change, and as a result, we're seeing populist authoritarianism. So, another thing you want to do as a budding dictator is promote a cult of personality. You want to get people to look up to you personally. You want to get people to emotionally identify with supporting you. Because here's the thing. If you're seen as a high status figure, and when I say status, I just mean social status is just what other people think of you, right? So being cool is an example of high social status. Celebrities have high social status. Politicians are seen as high social status amongst their fans, you know? I talk about social status a lot more in episode 13, which is called Why Do People Care So Much of Us? Sorry, why do we care so much about what people think of us? But yeah, basically, that's what it is. So, but again, people get irrational when it comes to high status figures. When we look up to someone, when we have a high status figure, people tend to just not brook criticism towards them. They tend to be really rabidly loyal towards them, which is why when you attack a high status celebrity, for example, Taylor Swift or Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump or even Andrew Tate, because again, they're high status in the eyes of those who look up to them, their fans tend to go rabid. They won't listen to any criticism of them and they will instead quite strongly attack you. We see this massively in politics. Leaders classically want to develop a cult of personality around them because if people see them as a high status figure, they won't put criticism against them. They won't logically criticize them. And again, we see this when people look up to political figures, even if they're objectively incompetent and shit, their supporters will still perceive them as great, competent, caring individuals. So again, if you want to reduce rationality, cult personality. And a final thing is, if you want to reduce rationality, you have to get people to stop believing stuff. You have to degrade the legitimacy of mainstream media. You have to invoke the narrative of fake news. But even though that's a neologism, so a neologism is just a term which has been coined recently. So fake news, Zoomer is an example of that. But it's been done. It's been done, for example, in the 1930s. It's just a classic move. Because, again, if you're a budding dictator, then in a fully fledged democracy, mainstream media is going to criticize you because you're deviating away from societal norms. You're trying to discourage rule of law and democracy, and you're trying to whip people up and piss people off and get them angry and get them worshipping you. So mainstream media is naturally going to criticize you. So what's really important is to degrade the legitimacy of that mainstream media, to basically say this is invalid. So, and again, that's what we see. And again, social media has made that way easier, because back in the 1930s, the Nazis had to actually set up a newspaper to churn out their propaganda. Now you just put it online. It's way easier. So these are kind of some of the main psychological mechanisms which dictators use. The key thing to take away is that when we're emotional, we're not thinking rationally. When we're not thinking rationally and when we're emotional, when we have this perception of threat, we cleave towards strong men who can take care of the situation for us. So this leads us to the question, what attitudes do dictators try and foster? So when I pose to you the question, what attitudes do dictators try and foster? What I'm trying to say is, as a result of these psychological mechanisms, as a result of a strong demonization of an outgroup, as a result of a strong perception of threat, as a result of rigid obedience to authority and lack of criticism of figures of authority, as a result of degraded legitimacy in mainstream media, and as a result of high levels of aggression, what are the political attitudes that we get as a result from that? So basically, what attitudes are populist authoritarians trying to foster? What attitudes do budding authoritarians want to foster? So this set of attitudes is referred to in political science discourse as right-wing authoritarianism. Now, that's important to dissect. Left-wing individuals or parties or ideologies can be authoritarian as well. So, for example, the USSR or China, all these are examples of far left authoritarianism. So it's not, when we say the term right-wing authoritarianism, it's saying that in political discourse because it's associated with socially conservative views. So in that socio-cultural axis we mentioned earlier, it's associated with right-wing views. But the key thing here really is the authoritarianism, because it talks about right-wing authoritarianism scales do explicitly measure views on things like feminism, etc. But the key is really your attitudes to authority, your attitudes to people who deviate from authority, your attitudes to conformity. So it is a socio-culturally right-wing phenomenon, but that's not something that I want to overemphasize. I want you to focus a bit more on the authoritarian rather than the right-wing, because the point I'm trying to make is that when we study right-wing authoritarianism or RWA, the psychological insights that we gain from it are bipartisan. So what is right-wing authoritarianism? Well, basically, right-wing authoritarianism, it's this set of attitudes, and it's basically someone who's very submissive to authority figures, who acts very aggressively in the name of these authority figures and on the command of these authority figures, and who is conformist in their thought and behavior. So nothing that I've just said is exclusive to the right wing of the socio-cultural spectrum. But as we're going to explore, these tend to be linked to socially conservative views. So basically, it's a high degree of submission to authorities who are perceived morally to be legitimate, not necessarily the legal authorities running society, but who the individual perceives as morally legitimate. And it's this kind of general aggressiveness against whoever, which is just sanctioned by these authority figures. And it's a high degree of adherence to social conventions that these authority figures endorse, and a high degree of backlash and punishment to people who deviate from these. So we have these three components of submissiveness, aggression, and conventionalism. So in terms of submissiveness, individuals who are high in right-wing authoritarianism, because right-wing authoritarianism, it's this set of attitudes, it's this sort of personality constellation, and it's dimensional, it exists on a spectrum. Individuals rank at different levels, at different degrees on this spectrum of right-wing authoritarianism. And at the high end, RWAs, right-wing authoritarians, tend to accept what their leaders will say is true, and they'll readily comply with their commands. And not only that, but they'll see obedience to that authority as morally legitimate. It's seen as immoral to criticize that, and means that people who do criticize that tend to just be dismissed as troublemakers and placed in an out-group. So people who are high in RWA tend to kind of foster very aggressive attitudes to people who criticize authority standards. And here's the thing, they will be submissive to authority figures who are actually objectively shit and incompetent, but they'll just perceive them as competent and honest, and they'll just dismiss any kind of notion to the contrary, rather. And they believe that these authorities have the right to make their own decisions, even if that means breaking rule of law and kind of superseding rule of law. And again, I mentioned this earlier, the authority figures in RWA are people who are seen as having a moral right to hold authority, not a legal right. So for example, in America, the attitude towards Obama is a really great example of this. So Obama was legally their president. Legally, Obama was the legitimate authority figure in the land. But individuals high in RWA just completely rejected anything he said. I mean, the Republican Party at the time just voted no on anything he tried to do. And an example of this is the kind of far-right birther movement. So the idea that it's this conspiracy that Obama was actually born in Kenya, and then he used a forged birth certificate to qualify as running for president, because in America, only Americans can run for president. So we have this idea of submissiveness. And what I've talked about, this kind of hostility against outgroups. So in this case, Obama ties into this component of aggression. So RWAs behave very aggressively towards people marked as an outgroup. And it tends to be people who are low in social status or sort of marginalized figures. So in the case of the Western world, or in the whole world really, feminists, homosexuals, other kinds of minorities. In Nazi Germany, this was Jews and communists, by the way. But the idea is that as long as the authority figure sanctions that attack, even if they're conventional members of society, they'll still be attacked. And this aggression is based on fear. It's based on a perception of threat. So when you have the Gamergate movement, for example, in I think 2016, where people just viciously attacked female figures who talked about feminism, that came from a fear of how feminism was changing society and changing social norms. So, I mean, it's not always fear of minorities. So RWAs can also show aggression against people like bullies or terrorists or foreign invaders. But the idea is that it's fear not just against actual legitimate threats, but people seen as morally degenerate. So feminists and homosexuals or atheists, for example. And RWAs very strongly believe in punishment, and they tend to recommend harsher punishment than individuals who rank low in RWA. They tend to be more in favor of corporal punishment or the death penalty. But here's the interesting thing. RWAs tend to be forgiving or even approving of crimes when the crime is committed from a high status individual against a low status individual. So for example, a policeman beating up a protester who's criticizing authority figures, or an accountant assaulting a beggar, or a homophobic protester assaulting a gay rights activist. These are examples given by Altemeyer, who's this researcher who looked a lot into right-wing authoritarianism. So the idea is that authoritarian aggression is about enforcing hierarchies and enforcing norms. And the final component is conventionalism. So RWAs have a very strong commitment to traditional norms and very strongly punish deviation from these norms. So they see conformity as a moral imperative. So how do we assess right-wing authoritarianism? Because again, it's something which is specific to individuals. So there's a scale that's used. It's 22 statements. And just some examples of this. So statement one, so you give people these statements and you ask them whether they agree. And one of them is, the established authorities generally turn out to be right about things, while the radicals and protesters are usually just loudmouths showing off their ignorance. Number two is, women should have to promise to obey their husbands when they get married. Number three, our authority desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. 7. The only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. Number 19, our country will be great if we honour the ways of our forefathers, do what the authorities tell us to do, and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything. These are just some examples. So it's just this way of kind of assessing this set of attitudes across with people, and you can see that it has a socially conservative bent. So it is right-wing in the sense of being socially conservative, but it's also an authoritarian phenomenon. So you could modify that scale for left-wing authoritarianism, for more progressive views, but that's not really big. There's no political scale for left-wing authoritarianism because that social conservatism and that authoritarianism really strongly occur together. Like when it comes to populist authoritarianism, those two things happen together. They're co-occurring. Now, when you actually look at right-wing authoritarianisms, we see, first of all, they tend to be much more sensitive to disgust. They tend to have a much stronger sensitivity to physical disgust, for example. They also tend to kind of not understand how radical their own views are. They tend to see, so studies show that they tend to believe that they're quite average in views. And also, Altemeyer found that when he gave lectures about the psychology of right-wing authoritarianism to students who ranked high in right-wing authoritarianism didn't recognize themselves in that description. So he also noticed, he gave his students a booklet that contained contradictory statements. So one of the statements was, when it comes to love, men and women with opposite points of view are attracted to each other. The other statement is, birds of a feather flock together when it comes to love. These are two contradictory statements. They can't both be true. But he found that students who ranked high in RWA tended to agree with both of them. So that compartmentalization was something that Altemeyer noticed. Another thing that he tended to notice was that individuals who rank high in RWA tend to hold very stubbornly to their beliefs. Everyone's reluctant to change their beliefs and they kind of hold to their beliefs, but RWAs are much more stubborn than others. They tend to cling to them much more rigidly. And in fact, a lot of the time, when you confront someone ranking high in RWA with contradictory evidence, it will reinforce their beliefs. It reinforces what they think. And finally, they have difficulty with reasoning. So, for example, there's a study which presented people with the following kind of set of premises. Number 1, all fish live in the sea. 2, sharks live in the sea. 3, therefore sharks are fish. Now this isn't true. That is incorrect, because sharks can live in the sea, but they're not necessarily fish. All fish live in the sea, sharks live in the sea. That doesn't mean that only individuals that fish live in the sea. It's just saying that all fish live in the sea. So these series of premises are incorrect, but individuals who ranked high in RWA were much less likely to realize that. Now, so unsurprisingly, based on what you might think from that, being high in RWA is consistently negatively correlated with IQ. So, and again, that's averages. It's possible to have someone who's high in RWA and also has a high IQ. That's not the point. The point is that on average, that tends to be the case. And what happens here when we have individuals who are high in RWA, it leads you, as you can see, as we discussed earlier, to a respect for tradition, obedience, conformity, and also irrationality. So we've kind of seen all that in this description of what's going on. Now, individuals who are high in RWA tend to vote for right-wing parties, which is understandable because they're right-wing. That makes complete sense. So, for example, in the United States, about 40% of people who voted for Trump in the 2020 election were in the highest quartile on the RWA scale. So the highest quartile, the highest 25%. So in contrast, a very negligible number of Biden voters in the 20% in the 2020 election scored in the highest quartile on the RWA scale. So we can see this kind of average shift. And we also see that people who have more formal education, so for example, people who are uni educated, tend to vote Democrat rather than Republican in the USA as well. And I'm using that as an example because it's just what we know. It's just what we're all familiar with. And by the way, just to add on, all this stuff makes sense because if you're a dictator, what you're trying to do is reduce rationality. You're trying to get people to be blindly obedient to you. You're trying to get people to be blindly aggressive to outgroups. You're trying to get people to blindly conform. So the fact that RWA, individuals who rank highly in RWA, tend to have lower capacities of rationality makes complete sense. That's exactly what a populist authoritarian wants. They would want a voter base who thinks like that. Now, that's not me saying that if you vote for someone who is a right-wing authoritarianism, you're stupid or you have a lower IQ. The point is that these correlations that I've just pointed out to you, it makes sense. It forms a comprehensive picture. It makes sense that that's what a dictator would want to do in order to get you to vote for them. So what does this all actually correspond to? So we've talked about how dictators want to foster, dictators now want to foster this increase in right-wing authoritarianism. So what changes in values, what changes in social cultural values does that actually correspond to? What do populist authoritarians want? So a way to conceptualize world values has actually been done by this massive survey called the World Values Survey. And it's this big global research project. It's been going on since 1981 now, and it just goes across loads of different countries, and it just asks them about socio-cultural values. It's basically found that how progressive a country is strongly correlated with economic performance. It's also, I don't think they specifically found this, but studies have also shown that more progressive countries tend to have higher average IQs. Again, that could just be due to the confounding factor of economic development, because changes in education, provision, and nutrition are also going to affect IQ. But the way that they do this, and you can actually see a really cool visualization of this, and it's called the Inglehart-Welzel Cultural Map of the World. And it's this, and I recommend looking it up. Oh, someone's knocking at my door. Give me a moment. How excited. Got a little visitor. Right, so basically, what happened is, so my toilet in my uni room has been fucked up for a bit of time now. So, like, it just won't flush sometimes, which I really don't like, because sometimes, like, a guest will come over and there'll just be, like, a loaf of shit in the toilet. And, like, that's not fun. No one wants to see that. So I've called a plumber. Well, I haven't called a plumber. I've told the uni dorm staff to, like, help me out. And they said they will. And the plumber's come today. And he can't come back at any later time. And it's going to take an hour and a half. And it's going to be really loud. And I can't record in the kitchen because the acoustics are ass in the kitchen. So what I've asked is I went down to the reception and I was like, can you, is there anywhere that I can record? Maybe. Actually, I have a podcast, so, and they gave me the key to another room. The acoustics of which are not as good, so I can hear an echo, and I really, really hate to give you guys poorer sound quality. But it should be alright, it's not too bad. We've got a dynamic mic, so it probably shouldn't be picking up as much fuckery. But anyway, I digress. So I was talking about this Inglehart-Welzel cultural map, and I really recommend looking at it. It's basically this kind of, you have this 2D graph with an x-axis and a y-axis, and you have loads of countries in the world plotted on this graph. And on each axis, y-axis versus x-axis, is a different set of social cultural values. So the x-axis is survival values versus self-expression values. On the y-axis is traditional values versus secular rational values. So what does this mean? So survival values are all about whether you value the value of economic and physical security. It's linked with like a low level of trust, low levels of tolerance, low levels of outgroup tolerance, a quite ethnocentric outlook, so one which focuses very much on your in-group and defines that in-group on an ethnic or national basis. Self-expression values are very much the opposite. So they give a lot of priority to well-being and happiness and quality of life and self-expression and individualism and being you. And it's linked to environmental protection, tolerance of foreigners, LGBT plus rights, gender equality, demands for more democracy and more decision-making in both political life, but also economic life. It's linked to a desire for liberty and libertarianism, so personal freedom and autonomy. It's linked to higher trust in society, more moderation in politics, more stability, and a shift in kind of child-rearing values, from rearing children in an emphasis on hard work and discipline towards imagination and tolerance. So traditional values are all about a set of values emphasizing the importance of religion, the link between parents and children, family authority, deference to authority, traditional family values, a rejection of divorce, abortion, euthanasia, suicide. And societies with high levels of traditional values it's linked to a high level of national pride and a more nationalistic outlook. So secular rational values are kind of the opposite. So societies which embrace secular rational values place much less emphasis on religion, traditional family values, power dynamics and authority. Divorce, abortion, euthanasia, suicide are seen as much more acceptable. And it's the replacement of religion and superstition and tradition and custom as bases for governing society, and a transition from that to the use of science, reason, and bureaucracy as the way of governing the relations of authority in society and kind of basing behavior in a society. And when countries industrialize, so when countries go from agricultural to industrial, they tend to transition from traditional values to secular rational values. And when societies reach a post-industrial state. So when you have a society where there's more economic activity in the service sector of society rather than the manufacturing sector of society, so more people in that society are doing things rather than making things, we see a transition from survival values to self-expression values and this embrace of a democratic mindset of democratic values. So when we talk about democratic values, we're talking about these self-expression values. And so if we look at that map, that Inglehart-Welzel cultural map, you can see that generally on that map, as countries get wealthier, they move diagonally from the bottom left to the top right. So we have these clusters of regions, and the most developed, so the region of countries with the highest HDI, but also the set of countries who are highest in self-expression values and secular rational values is Protestant Europe. The lowest kind of section of that is these African Islamic societies. So sub-Saharan societies, which are Islamic. Also, just generally, we have some Islamic societies like Gulf state societies, which tend to be towards the lower left of the spectrum. And also just generally Central Asian society in the Middle East and North Africa. There are lots of different iterations of this cultural map of the world, so different kind of files that you can find if you look it up online. If you look at the Wikipedia page for this, you'll see the 2004 one. But basically, we can see that there is a link between how people think and the kind of economic kind of development of that society. But there's also values differ within societies, of course, along kind of cleavage lines of generation, so age, gender, ethnicity, religious denomination, education, income, etc., etc., etc. So basically, what happens when we move from survival to self-expression values is that happens when each person's sense of individual agency increases. When the emphasis of a society's value system gets more on individual values, individual freedom, individual autonomy, the value of the individual. Now, when we look at social kind of secular self-expression values, a really key subset of self-expression values is known as emancipative values. And emancipative values is this kind of set of values in society. And when I say in society, I mean it's held in the individual's heads which comprise society. Society doesn't exist as this abstract organism detached from the people who make it up. It's an aggregate of individual psychologies. And emancipative values are all about freedom of choice and equality of opportunity. So emancipative values include gender equality, personal autonomy, the idea of the people having a voice in politics. It's basically about human empowerment. And it's kind of all about emancipative values are all about a public of a society being self-expressive. It's all about people being able to speak and being able to criticize their country and being able to reform their country in a better way. And emancipative values are very linked to women's rights and feminism and kind of institutional empowerment of women. Emancipative values aren't specific to the West, but they tend to be highest in the West, and they tend to be highest amongst liberals in the West. So emancipative values, they've been said to generate what's called a critical liberal desire for democracy. So the idea of criticizing the society around you and desiring a progressive reform to make it a better place. These are all very linked to emancipative values. Now, when we look at populist authoritarianism, what they really try and do is they try and move societal values towards the lower left of that Inglehart-Wells or culture map of the world. They try and move them towards survival values, and they try to move them towards towards traditional values. Because, dictatorship fundamentally is incompatible with self-expression and emancipative values. So you can understand a shift on that end of the spectrum. But we also see with the phenomenon of populist authoritarianism and in the way that dictatorships have been classically established in the West, both historically and as they are at risk of being established now, we also see a movement from secular rational values to traditional values. And we see this in the discourse of the American right. We see a much greater discourse about religion, a much greater emphasis on religion, on family values, on these traditional takes on modern social issues, and we see a devaluation of expert opinion. So Michael Gove puts this really well in the phrase, the nation has had enough of expert. So if you're a dictator, what you want to do, you want to use these psychological mechanisms that we talked about earlier, for example, outgroup stuff, threat generation, etc. And that means that you're trying to generate an atmosphere, trying to promote right-wing authoritarianism, and the actual value consequences of that are a shift to survival and traditional values. So to be a dictator, these are the cultural changes, the psychological changes that you promote. Now here's the thing. As a dictator, you're not acting in a vacuum. The strength of populist authoritarian demagogues comes from their ability to appeal to these pre-existing psychological trends in society. So if you look at populist authoritarians now, they're not talking about Jews or communists in the way the Nazis did. They talk about immigrants because this is the current outgroup that's already in people's heads. So rather than an outgroup being cooked up out of nowhere, it's more that these figures take advantage of pre-existing trends, of pre-existing emotions. These individuals like Modi, for example, with his Hindutva, his Hindu nationalism policy, he didn't just conjure that out of thin air. That's something which is a pre-existing element in the fabric of that society. What these populist authoritarians do is bring that more to the surface, capitalize on it, and popularize it. And then they use that to drive them into power. They exploit these pre-existing psychological tendencies in a society to gain power. And this keeps happening. And we're seeing it happen right now, again and again and again in Eastern Europe, in Brazil, in India, in the West. Because it's easy. It's easy because in order to you're not appealing to people's better side. You're not appealing to people's reasons. You're appealing to their sense of emotion. You are appealing fundamentally to hatred and fear. And these are innate human capacities which are easy to trigger because people are emotional. As I said earlier, people are fundamentally irrational in the sense that they are more driven by their emotions when it comes to political views than reason. And if you give people the choice between emotion and reason, so for example, if you have someone who really firmly believes a particular ideology and you give them, or really believes in the status and the greatness of a particular figure, and you give them clear evidence to the contrary, 99% of the time, they'll just rationalize that in some way and move on. And you've probably seen that. If you've ever tried to debate people with politics, you'll see this. You'll make some rational criticism of a viewpoint or a high status figure that someone else holds, and they'll just find they'll just cook up some bullshit to ignore it. Or they'll just deny the veracity of it out of reflex. Because of course they're going to do that. Rationality, humans are capable of rationality, but it's something that human beings tend to use. People tend to use their powers of intelligence and eloquence in politics to justify their pre-existing gut feelings and intuitions and their pre-existing moral values. And when I say moral values, I'm referring to something called moral foundations theory, which we talk about in previous episodes. So in episode 5, we talk about moral foundations a lot. I'm not going to get into it here, but and when I say moral foundation theory, I don't just mean it's some prediction. A theory is not the same as a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a prediction. A theory is a model of the world based on evidence. And moral foundations theory has a large bulk of evidence behind it. And it basically says that moral foundations theory states that the reasons why people differ in political views, so example, progressive or conservative, is because when it comes to their moral values, so stuff like respect for authority, loyalty, freedom, proportionality, so people getting what they're owed, equality, people vary in the emphasis that they give to these moral foundations. And that leads to divergences in political views. But what I'm trying to say is that right-wing authoritarianism, so populist authoritarianism, it's easy because you're appealing to what people already have. You're appealing to these innate psychological tendencies. All you're doing is voicing them and bringing them out. And by constructing an identity where it becomes acceptable to voice these, you just get this process of because if you're a racist in a society that says racism is bad, it's going to be very difficult for you to bring that to the surface. Everyone shits on you for it. But if you're in an environment where the boundaries of that badness get skirted, where racist stuff is kind of acceptable to say. And I'm going to use the example of Trump saying immigrants eating cats and dogs in Ohio, because it's something that, again, will be on your minds, which is why I'm saying it. But it's not exclusive to Trump or the Republican Party by any means. But the point is that creation of an environment where that becomes normalized is a very key element in how democracies backslide. Because what you're doing is, there's this thing called the Overton window. The Overton window is this idea that in mainstream media and political discourse, there's this window of views which are acceptable to say. So every society has its normative beliefs, stuff that's kind of like a normal belief in society. So everyone's in the West, the normative belief in the West is that racism is wrong. Most people, when they're asked, is racism good, will say no. And that's just an example, right? So we have normative views in society, and we have progressive views in society, which are a bit more left-wing than that, but they're still fine. And right-wing societies are a bit more conservative than that, but they're still fine. And then we have views which are dicier, but still okay. And then we have views which are kind of skirting the boundary of what's okay. And then you have views that you just can't say, that aren't acceptable. But the idea is that with populist authoritarianism, the use of language, that demonization of outgroups, what you're doing is you're shifting that Overton window in a certain direction. You're trying to change how people perceive the acceptability of discourse. You're trying to normalize certain ways of thinking and certain ways of speaking. So, for example, if you look at the Nazi Party, they didn't just jump straight to the Nuremberg laws. They did that gradually by shifting the Overton window, by gradually dehumanizing that outgroup, which in their case were Jews, and gradually changing public perceptions of them, and gradually normalizing more and more vicious things to be said about them. And that's how it's done. You promote a threat, and human psychology does the rest. And here's the thing. So the Nazis succeeded in doing this in the 1930s, as did Mussolini. And of course, I mean, I'm using those two as key examples, but there are other examples as well. So it was still possible back then. But with social media, it's way easier. Because with the social media, it's much easier to construct echo chambers, first of all. Because the way that these algorithms work is that they're giving you content that they know you'll engage with. So these companies like Meta, for example, are playing a massive role in driving political polarization because they're just feeding. Not only are they feeding echo chamber thinking, but they're allowing really quite extreme ideologies. I mean, Andrew Tate is an example of this. Andrew Tate became a phenomenon because social media algorithms pushed him on everyone. You got thrown into Andrew Tate's arms with these social media algorithms because they noticed that people were engaging with that content and they promoted it to people. So political polarization, toxic political polarization, the rise of authoritarian populism, a lot of it's driven by these social media algorithms because everybody uses them. So a few CEOs, a few companies, so if you look at Mark Zuckerberg, for example, are playing a massive role in changes to Western political life and decreases in political civility and stability. And if you look at X or Twitter, I don't know why Elon Musk called it X, which is Elon Musk took like a thriving platform and then just completely gouged it for no conceivable reason. But Elon Musk, for example, so on Trump's election in 2024, Elon Musk was there with him on this day, celebrating with him personally and was going on stage. So you have someone who's clearly highly partisan, but is also in charge of a very influential social media company. And you can imagine, because people aren't rational, they are biased, that the way that he's regulating that company is also going to be biased. So there's going to be much less action taken against the promotion of extreme right-wing ideologies and probably no action taken against promotion of Republican Party populist authoritarian ideology, because that's what he wants. That's the ideology he agrees with. The point that I'm trying to make is that social media is a really, really bad driver of everything that I've just talked about. All these psychology mechanisms we talked about, social media, really bad driver of it. And we talk a little bit more about that in episode 15 on Is Humanity Getting Dumber? So that brings us to the end of today's episode. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I really enjoyed talking about, as you can see, and you can kind of tell by like the feverish way that I'm speaking. I really wanted to get all this out because it's very interesting and it's very relevant. So I hope you're all doing well and I wish you the very best of days. I'm really honored to everyone who makes it to the end of these. I'm really, really honored. So thank you so much and have a lovely day. Take care and goodbye.